People travel for all kinds of reasons. You know, you make a run to the grocery store, that's travel. You make a shot to the moon, that's travel. You go on a vacation to see the Grand Canyon, that's travel. People travel all the time. It's what we Americans do. We jump in our car and we go places. And it's probably true for most Americans, I would say. It's probably true for most Americans that their first great adventure is on the big yellow school bus. Do you remember your first day climbing on the big yellow school bus? I remember that very well. I remember my first day in school. I grew up in southeastern Kentucky a long time ago. Kindergarten hadn't been invented yet, so you just started right in on first grade. And I was so excited to start in first grade as a 6-year-old, and I was going to get to ride the big yellow school bus. And I had my book sack by my side and my Charlie Brown lunchbox, and I was standing by the side of the road waiting. My mama was in her bathrobe and fuzzy slippers on the front porch watching to make sure I didn't get out in the road and get run over by the big yellow school bus when it came down the road. And finally, the bus pulled up and the door swung open. You could hear those air brakes go, pshh. You knew you were in for something very exciting. And I was so little, I couldn't even get up the first step. So I had to fling my lunchbox in, fling my book bag in, and then crawl up the first step and then on up into the bus. And when I got onto the bus, I realized the whole bus was empty. There was nobody else on yet. I was the very first stop in the morning. And then, of course, as the bus came home from school, I was the very last stop in the afternoon. And the bus driver looked at me and he said, "Oh, I am so glad a big, capable boy like you is my first stop, my first passenger. Look at my arm." My bus driver's name was Mr. Minks. And Mr. Minks had fallen just 2 weeks before school had started and broken his arm. And he was wearing a plaster cast that covered the top of his hand and went all the way up past his elbow up to the shoulder. You know those kind of casts where they kink your arm like that and you walk around like a robot for the next 6 weeks? He was doing his best to keep his school bus driving job in that cast. He said, "I cannot shift this bus. So today, what's your name?" I said, "My name is Timmy Lowry." He said, "You're going to learn how to drive a stick shift, Timmy Lowry." He said, "This is what's going to happen. You stand right here next to this big stick." He said, "Do you know your letters?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, look at on the top of this stick, there's a little diagram like the letter H with an extra hitchik. That's reversed, but you don't need to worry about that. So here's what we're going to do." He said, "You hold on this stick, and I'm going to mash in this pedal. When I'm mashing in this pedal, I say go, and you pull it down, that's second gear. And then when I say go again, you kind of go over and up into third gear, and then we get going really fast, and you hear the engine whining, I'll mash in the clutch, and you pull it down into fourth, and we're going to help all these boys and girls get to school." I said, "Okay." So I grabbed the gear shift, and away we went. And the bus was lurching back and forth. Oh, it was terrific. And then when we got to school, it was pretty smooth by the time we got to school. When we got to school, I hopped off the bus and ran into Rosspoint Elementary School in Harlan County, Kentucky to meet my teacher. I'm sure my mom and dad had met her at Meet the Teacher night a day or two before, but I didn't know what I was in for. There were 5 classrooms in our school. There was just one long hallway with a cafeteria at the end, and our library was in a corner of the cafeteria. Our library consisted of 4 bookshelves, 2 on one wall, and then you turn the corner and there were 2 on another, and there was a big rug in the middle of those bookshelves, and twice a week, a lady with a mustache named Mrs. Howard came, and she would help you check books off of those shelves. That was our library. And right next to the library and the cafeteria was my first grade classroom, and my teacher was Mrs. Wilder. Mrs. Wilder kept everything she needed for teaching school on her person. You know how cowboys like strap their guns on and they have their bandana and their hat and they can put water in their boot if they need to and all of that? That was Mrs. Wilder. She had everything she needed for educating the youth of southeastern Kentucky on her body. She didn't carry a purse. She didn't carry a book bag. She tucked most of the most useful things that she needed down there. Yes. Close to her heart. She kept money down there. Yeah, so when you went to the cafeteria, if you had forgotten your lunch money, that was a big problem because the lady in the hairnet who ran the cash register was going to fuss at you. But Mrs. Wilder would see you kind of getting nervous and sweat dripping off your brow because you didn't have any lunch money and you'd already had your tray and you didn't know how you were going to pay. And she'd walk over to you and say, "What's the matter, honey? Did you forget your lunch money?" And she'd reach in and pull out a dollar bill and hand it to you. And lunch was like 35 cents in those days. So there was change, and she dropped the change down there. and it didn't even jingle around. She kept makeup down there. She would tuck compact in on one side and lipstick in on the other. And after she had finished her lunch, she would reach in and kind of cross draw and pull those out, flip open her compact and put on a little lipstick and then tuck that back in. She kept a spoon down there. But that was not for the cafeteria. No, that was for reading class. I learned to read with 3 friends. They were probably your friends too. Their names were Dick, Jane, and Spot. I can tell you why the youth of America doesn't read. They do not know our friends, Dick, Jane, and Spot. And it all went downhill in 2nd grade because Spot died and they got a new dog named Lad, and it was never the same after that. But we would be sitting there reading about Dick, Jane, and Spot, and the story was so predictable. I bet you could tell me chapter 2. Chapter 1 went like this. See Dick run, run Dick run. See Jane run, run Jane run. Well, you knew when you flipped the page it was going to be see Spot run, run Spot. So you would turn and talk to your neighbor about anything besides Dick, Jane, and Spot. And you were always shocked that Mrs. Wilder had caught you talking to your neighbor. I don't know how she saw us. We were always so discreet. But she would always catch you. And when she caught you, she would push her chair back, and you would hear her chair creak as she stood up, and then you would hear her sensible lace-up shoes banging on that wooden floor as she came across the classroom toward your little desk, and she would reach in, pull out that spoon, wipe it off on the hem of her dress, and say, tongue needs something to do, suck on this spoon a while, and she poked the spoon right in your mouth. And you did not dare remove that spoon. And you did not complain about it. You would go home on the big yellow school bus and tell your mama, Mrs. Wilder stuck a spoon in my mouth today. And every mama in Harlan County, Kentucky would say the same thing. They'd say, well, of course she did. She stuck a spoon in my mouth when I was in 1st grade. How are you going to learn to read unless you get spooned by Mrs. Wilder? Everybody in Harlan County had been spooned by Sierra Wilder at least once or twice. Now, if you talked during math class, she had an entirely different punishment. She would come over to your little desk, and she was going to drag you bodily, desk and all, to a new location. And when she bent over your desk, you could see down there. And that was punishment enough in itself. She would drag your desk over to these great big triple sash windows. You remember those windows? They had like chains on the side with little lead weights, and the weights caused the window to go up and down. It worked very much like a guillotine. You were never to put your head out of that window. And she would have those windows open for fresh air, and she would bring your little desk over and put you in front of the desk, and she'd point to a tree on the playground. She'd say, you see that oak tree out there on the playground? Yes, ma'am. I know how many leaves are on that oak tree. And we believed her because we knew she had planted it in 1957 for Arbor Day. There was a plaque right there next to the tree. I'm going to ask you in 15 minutes how many leaves are on that tree. And if you don't have the right number, oh, you're going to wish you did. So we'd start counting leaves on a tree. Of course, school starts in the fall of the year. So then the wind would blow and leaves would fall off, and we'd start crying. She'd say, see there, you can't even subtract a few leaves from the total number on a tree. That's why you need to study mathematics. Now get your desk, get it back in line, and pay attention. There was one child in my class. His name was Todd. He was a little bit of a smart aleck, and he was brave enough to say to her one day, my brother Spencer was in 1st grade last year, and he counted leaves on this tree, and he told me how many there were. But you could never get ahead of her. She said, every fall they fall off, and God puts on a new number, and he only tells me, so you better start counting. You could not get away from her. She was everywhere. She rode the big yellow school bus. We heard her tell the bus driver, why pay for gas when the bus will take you to work for free? And she never did any after-school duty. If you are a school teacher present in this audience, I'll tell you how to get rid of afternoon duty. Ride the school bus. We would see the principal go, I need you. She said, oh, that's my ride, gotta go. And she'd just hop on the bus and away she went. She was done 2:30 every afternoon. She lived in a big old Victorian house way up on a hill, not all that far from the school. She was the first drop-off when we would come home in the afternoon. And because she was very old, our bus would pull right up her driveway and pick her up right off her front porch every morning. But one morning, the bus driver could not pick her up because overnight her water hose had broken and water had trickled down her driveway and had frozen, and her driveway was a solid sheet of slick ice. And so the bus driver opened up the door and he yelled up to her. He said, "Wilder, I cannot come up there and get you. It's too slick." She said, "Wait. I can't miss school. I can't miss school." She went around behind her house and got a cardboard box, ripped that thing open, put it on ice, sat down on that cardboard and went vroom right down the hill. Hopped on the bus, threw the cardboard off in the weeds. We all cheered and clapped. She put one hand to her heart and we went, so we knew the spoon was ever present. School provided so many wonderful adventures for me. When I graduated from first grade, I moved on to second grade, and second grade was just a blur because the main thing was cursive writing, linking all those letters together. I will never forget, there was a row of Conestoga wagons across the top of the chalkboard, and the A linked to the B, linked to the C, linked to the D. That's really all I remember about second grade. And then in third grade, we had a teacher who was fresh out of teacher college. She was a progressive. And we learned our multiplication tables with disco. Saturday Night Fever was the hit movie that year, and she put a disco ball in the back of the room and would put on records from Saturday Night Fever, and we would stand back there with our white bell-bottom pants and our collars that went out to our end of our collarbones, and we would practice our timetables. 2 times 2 is 4, chicka, 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 4 times 4 is 8, chicka, chicka, chicka. It was terrific. I still cannot do any math in my head unless I can get a beat going. And then in fourth grade, I had Mrs. Pauline Wilson. She was a force. Pauline Wilson was the chain-smoking daughter of a thrice-dunking Baptist preacher. You were raised Baptist. Yeah. Did they dunk 3 times at your church? Her daddy was a thrice dunker, which means when you got into the river, he would put you under once for the Father, and then again for the Son, and a third time for the Holy Spirit. And he would pray for you all 3 times while you were under the water. Man, you better be a champion swimmer before you went forward for baptism. She had big, long, red fingernails and smoked like a stack. And she had 2 favorite subjects. Pauline Wilson loved fractions and the apocalypse. And if you were not successful with the first, you would suffer the latter. Now, if we ever wanted to get her off track, not that any of you children would ever do that to your teacher, but if we ever wanted to get her off track so that we could avoid a math quiz on fractions, all we had to do was bring up the apocalypse. It was the height of the Cold War. You know, everybody was talking about nuclear holocaust. So we'd go home, watch the 6 o'clock news, and then we'd come back to school the next day and we'd say, Miss Wilson, did you see the news last night? Russians, they got all kinds of secret missiles, and the United States has got silos all over the place, and one of these days somebody's going to press a big red button, and everything's just going to be, and then she'd get all upset, and she'd say, vaporize, that's what's going to happen, vaporize, just, whoo, everything's gone. I know all about this. My daddy is a Baptist preacher. It's in the book of the Revelation. Russia is the bear. China is the dragon. United States is going to work in there somewhere. One of these days, somebody's going to press the button and bam, vaporize. That's what's going to happen to all of us. She'd get herself so worked up, she'd need a cigarette. So she would let us go out on the playground to play, and she'd go to the teacher's lounge to smoke. You remember going to the teacher's lounge to run an errand, you'd open the door, and this big blue cloud would come wafting out into the hallway? That was because they were all worried about the apocalypse. So she'd go to the teacher's lounge to smoke, and we'd go outside to play. She used to send us across the road to the convenience store to buy Virginia Slims for her. Yeah. She would get into her pocketbook and take out money, and she'd say, here's some money. I want you to go across the store and get me a pack of Virginia Slims. Tell them it's for me, and they'll sell them to you. And I want one of those Tab Colas. You remember Tab Cola? That pink pop? And she'd say, there'd be a little extra. You could buy yourself something for running that errand for me. One day, she gave me money and sent me to get the cigarettes and the Tab Pop. And with the change, I thought, well, Miss Wilson drinks that Tab Cola. I think I'll get me one of those pink pops. I would have rather had a cigarette. Oh, that was the nastiest tasting stuff. I thought, well, you know, if the Russians land, all we have to do is poison them with this pink pop. Ugh. But we took all of her lectures about the apocalypse very seriously. So when she went to the teacher's lounge to smoke, we'd go out on the playground, we'd sit on the swing set, swing back and forth real slow, and we'd try to figure out what would our plan be if the Russians landed while we were at school. We'd all seen old World War II movies where the paratroopers came down out of the sky. We figured it'd be something like that, you know, parachutes and then blowing kids away on the playground. So we had to have a plan. And my friend Jeff, he said, I know exactly what we'll do. I know what we'll do. I've got it all worked out. You know when we go to the end of the hallway and you go into the cafeteria library and there's that door on the other side of the cafeteria library with the big red sign on it that says, do not open, alarm will sound? Yeah. We're going to run down the hallway. When the Russians land, we'll run down the hallway, go through the cafeteria, bust that door open, the alarm will go off, and that'll call the police and let our parents know the Russians have landed, and then we're going to run down the road, across the bridge, up the hill to Mrs. Wilder's house, and jump down there. And they will never think to look for us. And that was the end of that.